thank you for inviting me to talk on this topic of domestic abuse and the effects, direct effects actually, that it has on mental health. Just to give you a brief background of me, I'm Head of Services for Training and Education at Women's Aid Federation England. We deliver suites of qualifications and lots of training offers and bespoke training as well. But I have worked as a practitioner for many years in the sector, supporting women in refuges in the community, families, etc. This is something that is particularly close to Women's Aid's heart this year, because last year we launched a huge mental health campaign. So just to start with, I want to have a look, if you can move on to the next slide, the key drivers. Thank you. Yeah. So we absolutely know that the perpetration of domestic abuse is a key driver of women's mental health. There's lots of other people that have carried out research, but we carry out quite a lot of research on this, and we have done in particular in the last 24 months. Our most recent research was in 2021, and you can see there that nearly half of all the women that went into refuge services in England reported depression and having suicidal thoughts, and they reported that as a direct link to their experiences of domestic abuse. We've had 2 literature reviews on mental health and domestic abuse, which highlighted the many barriers that survivors, victims face in actually accessing mental health support, and the further barriers that exist, in particular for Black and minoritized or marginalized groups who face intersecting forms of oppression, such as racism, ableism, etc. So we've conducted research to better understand what survivors, victims of domestic abuse actually want and value from mental health services and support in general for their mental health. Thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you. So before I go on to looking at the direct links to mental health and how that happens, if you like, how the huge connection that there is, I actually want to give you an understanding of what domestic abuse is, because I think it's really important that you understand what it is before we start to talk about the links to mental health. Thank you. Next slide. Thank you. So this is a theoretical model of domestic abuse. It's actually a very old model. It's a 1980s theoretical model. It's called the Duluth model. We use it across the whole of our sector and across the 4 nations, but it's used worldwide as well, and it hasn't changed. So what we do know about domestic abuse, that typically perpetrators of domestic abuse use 8 main strategies to control their partner. So we're talking about intimate partner violence here. We're not talking about family violence, we're talking about intimate partner violence. And those 8 main strategies are intimidating their partner, emotionally abusing their partner, and isolating them from their communities, their friends and their family. Generally, they minimise the strategies of abuse that they use, or they actually deny that they've ever happened. The other thing that happens quite often is that they will blame their partner for the abusive strategies that they're using. Where there are children, when they're living together and post-separation, the children are used. There's typically gender privilege, and this can happen in same-sex relationships as well, but more often in heterosexual relationships where it's male on female abuse, which is the most common type of domestic abuse. So generally domestic abuse is perpetrated in a same-sex couple, and it's male on female predominantly. Doesn't mean it can't happen in other relationships, because it absolutely can, and we do support domestic abuse, which is the other way around as well, male on female and single-sex relationships as well. But the thing about heterosexual relationship is that generally when you run perpetrators programs, the perpetrators of that abuse have a real sense of ownership over the partners. It's the way that they talk, and they also often hold very gender stereotypical images of what a relationship should look like, and not only what it should look like, the types of things that are related to male roles and female roles in those relationships, and they come out over and over again when you're running perpetrators program. Economic abuse, which is also financial abuse, extremely common with domestic abuse, and then coercion and threats. And it's this what I'm going to concentrate on, because all the other things are all part of coercion. Now, this wheel came about in the 1980s in Duluth. It's an American model in Minnesota, because they decided that in order to tackle domestic abuse, you need a whole system approach. So they trained everybody up. They trained the judges, the magistrates, the correction, which is our probation. They trained providers of services, policing, and they introduced mandatory arrest. And part of that mandatory arrest was that perpetrators went onto a perpetrators program to look at how they can change their behaviour. And alongside that, they ran survivors support groups for their partners. And within 6 months, a very short space of time, working with hundreds of women, they discovered that they were all describing their relationships exactly the same. Now, they were all unique, but they were all describing these 8 main strategies of abuse that were very apparent within their relationships. And that is how the Duluth Power and Control Wheel came about. I've worked in the sector for over 30 years, and when I speak to survivors today, they talk about these very things that are happening. But I want to explain how an abusive relationship starts. So if you can just move on to the next slide, please. Thank you, and leave it there. So now, if you can just leave it there, that would be great. So what we do know is that every relationship starts the same, and that's whether it's abusive or non-abusive. They all start the same. Now, if I was in the room with you, I would be asking you to put your hands up. If you were barristers, if you were judges, because we train lots of different people. So all relationships start the same. And I would normally be saying to you, why do you think that might be? But I would also be saying to you, think about this. If a perpetrator of domestic abuse showed himself at the very beginning of a relationship, so on a first date, first few weeks of a new relationship, think about this. If they showed themselves, if they threat you, if they were emotionally abusive, psychologically abusive, physically abusive to you within that short period of time when your relationship is new, what could you do very easily? And what the room often says, and feel free to put things in the chat, is you can actually walk away from that relationship very easily. And the reason that you can walk away from that relationship very easily is because there is nothing to keep you there. So you've not fallen in love with that person, you've not moved in with them, you've not had children with them, you've not got debts with them. So all the things that keep someone in a relationship don't exist. Now, perpetrators of domestic abuse know that. So if you can just put the next word up, that would be great. So what they do is they take victims, survivors of domestic abuse through a type of conditioning. We call it conditioning. We don't use the word grooming because that's more associated with sexual grooming. So we say it's a conditioning. And when you do therapeutic work and counselling work with women that have experienced domestic abuse, they describe this. They describe the fact that when that relationship started, it was great. It was everything that they thought they wanted, but then things changed. So last Saturday I was training criminal barristers in London, and I asked them, the room was full, and I asked them, put your hands up if every statement that you read from the police, if every affidavit, so that's like a statement for the civil courts from a survivor, if every witness statement from friends and family start the same, in that the relationship was really good and then it changed, and the whole room put the hand up, because that's the truth. And that is why people say they don't know how they got into this relationship, because that isn't shown at the beginning. So there's this conditioning takes place. It's very coercive in nature, so it's very difficult to recognise. So what happens is gradually that survivor starts to change the way that she operates within that relationship in order to accommodate that perpetrator's needs and asks. So at first, and I'm giving real examples here, at first it might be things like, do you know what, I prefer you with less makeup on. I don't know why I do, but I just love that natural look. And you've started wearing, you know, quite a lot of makeup lately. And I'm not suggesting that you know, change the way that you look or anything, but I'm just telling you that you know, that's what I prefer. So survivors will say to you, so I started wearing less makeup and then I got complimented on how I looked. But then things change. So it can be about how you look. It can be where you go, who you see. You're always going out with your friends and your colleagues at work. Twice a week last week you went out with them. Hey, if you don't want this relationship, just tell me, and then you can stay with your friends. And they're at a point there where they want that relationship to work, and they start hashing and rehashing the things that they're being told, and they start to change them. Yeah, I am being a bit unreasonable, you know, we've moved in together, and I do go and see my family, you know, I see my mum, I pop in on the way home from work, which makes me later. I think I'm being a bit inconsiderate. It changes. Now, where it becomes coercion is when punishment is attached to not conforming. So with coercion, there's always a punishment attached to not conforming in that relationship. It's not recognised as that, but it's what happens. So that woman that stopped wearing her makeup tells me that a few weeks later, this was the first physical assault. She remembers very clearly that she thought she'd stopped going out with her colleagues and her friends, so she was starting to be quite isolated. It was a colleague's birthday at work that she was particularly close to, and they were all going out after work for a drink. So she went home the night before and she said to her partner, look, it's so-and-so's birthday at work and I want to go out for this drink. And I'm going to go, so I hope that's okay. And he said, yes, that's fine. I'll drop you off and I'll pick you up. So there are high levels of surveillance with domestic abuse as well. Generally, perpetrators want to know where you are and who you're with every minute of the day. So they'll call you at work, they'll text you, they'll FaceTime you when you're out, they'll put trackers on your phone. So you're having to contend with all this as well. At first, it's done in a very loving way. A text message, it might be, I'm really missing you, what time are you going to be home? But then gradually it's, why haven't you answered your phone, get yourself home? And if they don't, you get that punishment. So what this woman said was, she went and got changed and she came down and she had makeup on, and he said to her, why are you wearing makeup? And she said, well, I just thought I would, I'm going out, you know, we're going out. So he said, go upstairs and take it off now. So she said, I don't want to. So he got hold of her by the throat and he said, go and take it off now. And that was the first assault that she remembered. And she said she could remember walking upstairs, taking the makeup off, coming down, and he drove her to the venue that they were meeting at. And her friend came to the car and said, there's no need to pick her up. There's no need to pick her up. We can share a taxi. Nothing was said other than, well, what time are you going to be home? And she said, well, I need a time because I'll worry about you. So she said, okay, about 11:30. They got stuck in a taxi queue. They couldn't get a taxi. So it was about 20 past midnight when she got in. And she said the house was in darkness. It was a solid wooden front door. She walked up to the front door. She put a key in the lock. She walked into the house. She just assumed he'd gone to bed. And as she turned to shut the door, she was knocked unconscious. And she said, as she was lying on the floor coming round, he was stood over her saying, this is your fault. This is your fault. I rang you, I text you, you didn't have the decency to respond to my calls, and I've been worried sick about you. You have made me sit for 40 minutes worrying about where you are, what you're doing. You could have had your drink spiked, you could be anywhere, I didn't know. This is your doing. And she actually said, then she thought, why didn't I answer those calls or text messages? She didn't think, he's got no right to do this to me. She didn't think that. And she went on. And as that relationship developed, as for all victims of domestic abuse, they enter the world of that perpetrator. They engage in those rules and they start to believe everything they're being told. They're too fat, they're too thin, they're ugly, they're useless, don't learn to drive, you've got no sense of direction, don't go into further education, you're too stupid, you're a stupid mother. And they start to believe those things. And what happens then, you can go on with the next arrow and the next word, please. What happens then is that can you just move the slide on just to the next word, please? And again, that's right. So what happens then? It creates a dependency. Once that survivor is dependent on that relationship, she believes that she actually cannot manage on her own. She's going to be a complete failure on her own. She's going to lose everything, her house, her pets, her children. So she becomes totally dependent on that. And you can finish this slide off now, please. That would be great. And then from there, what happens is they get trapped. Instilled fear traps them into that relationship. They're not allowed to make choices or options, and they actually lose the ability to decide for themselves. And what often happens when they come in touch with other professionals, can be health professionals, that they might disclose a little bit of domestic abuse, and they're given options, and often they're overloaded with information, and they forget about it because there's a real sense, they lose a sense of recall. So sometimes when there's something's happened and they report it and they're asked for statements, they lose their sense of recall and they can't remember every little detail. And actually they get a lot of further institutional abuse as well, from other professionals that don't understand what's really going on. So next slide, please. So why does living with domestic abuse have such an impact on mental health? Well, the reason is because that coercion, that controlling behaviour, and those range of acts that I've described to you make that person subordinate. So they're dependent on them, they're isolated, they're exploiting, all the resources go, any capacity of personal gain disappears because they're isolated from the community, the friends and the family, and they lose their independence. So them escaping from that relationship becomes extremely difficult because their everyday life is regulated by that perpetrator. So coercive behaviour is a pattern of all sorts of different things that I've just described to you. But at the end of the day, they're living in total fear, and that has a direct impact on their mental health. Next slide, please. So it's really important to understand coercion as a professional. I'm linking it particularly with health professionals here today because it's a health summit, but any professional actually who comes into contact with a survivor of domestic abuse. The thing about coercion is that it's invisible. It's the way that perpetrators behave and control the person that they live with. What we see are the effects of it as professionals, and what makes it really difficult about coercion is that it needs to be evidenced in a court of law. So we teach professionals how to write in their records in order to evidence coercive control, because that evidence needs to be got from lots of different places, from policing, from health, from specialist interventions, from drug and alcohol services, everyone. And it's about how they do that. So it uses all those different strategies in order to control, and that increases the harm month in, year on, year in. So ultimately they're trapped there. This was made illegal, coercive control, in December 2015, and it carries a 5-prison sentence. So you can see the damage that occurs to a victim of domestic abuse for it to carry such a heavy sentence. Next slide, please. And the other thing is that is usually nearly always there, 99.9% of the time, is that you get economic abuse. Lots of people think of economic abuse as financial abuse. Financial abuse is monetary. It's about controlling money, which occurs with domestic abuse. Economic abuse goes that one step further, because what they're doing there is restricting, exploiting, sabotaging other resources such as housing, food, property and employment. So there's a link there to actually what Laura was talking about with menopause. So it can be very easy actually to mistake what's happening to someone that's living in an abusive relationship and put a mental health label on it or other labels on it too. So we really need to be astute as practitioners to be able to have those conversations and understand them. Next slide, please. And you can put the rest up. So effects here, that's right, on mental health. If you keep going, I don't know why it's doing that, apologies. So these are the effects that we see, that we may see as practitioners, and particularly with health. So they're continually living in fear, and you'll see a crossover here to some of what Laura was saying, ironically, about menopause. They experience anxiety at very high levels. They're continually doubting themselves and confused because they're told that it's their fault all the time, and they're readjusting their lives to try and get back that person that they had at the beginning of that relationship, which of course never really existed. But we all work really hard at our relationships. We don't want them to fail. And survivors of domestic abuse are no different. Some of them will self-harm as coping mechanisms. Some of them attempt suicide as well. There can be eating disorders. They get flashbacks. They get nightmares. They lose sleeplessness. They become powerless. Real difficulty with decision making. They can have that numbing effect. They can also feel anger and rage depending on what stage they're at that relationship. They can disassociate themselves, and that can lead to real mental health issues, and they can experience depression. They can go to anyone that works in the health service. It could be a GP, it could be a practice nurse, it could be that they've gone for some unrelated thing, and they may be talking about some of these things, and that health practitioner is not really picking those things up. So they also get things like palpitations, so they will get physical anxiety as well, and sometimes they lose their jobs. They're forced to lose their jobs. So we always ask and work with employers to introduce domestic abuse policies and look at how they can support that, because once someone loses their job, they're far less likely to leave that relationship because it's a cut-off point to becoming self-sufficient. So these are all the things that we need to look at. So we did a piece of research. Often they get labelled with mental health issues, when in actual fact what they're experiencing, just the same as with menopause, with what Laura was saying earlier, is directly associated with their experiences. So it's actually psychologically and physically the body responding normally, and we have to normalise that for them, to say what you're experiencing now is normal. It's absolutely normal. It's your body responding to trauma, and that is a lot of the work that we do. So this is what survivors told us. Do you want to put the next slide up? From this campaign, Deserve to be Heard, which we were looking at mental health needs, we spoke to lots of survivors and we carried out research. You can put the next slide up, and this is what survivors told us. We absolutely know that the elements of experiencing trauma need a specific response. So survivors of domestic abuse, if they're going to share with you what has happened in their relationship and seek support for that, they need an environment where they can trust you. They need to feel safe and they need to feel empowered. So looking at choices and giving them choices is very empowering, and then it helps them take control back of their life and collaborate. If you collaborate with them as professionals, that is the way in. And it's what we call a trauma-informed approach. And it links directly to what the survivors told us that they need, and in particular from health practitioners. So if you want to put the next slide up, that would be great. So what they told us was that what they required in order to be able to leave that relationship and get the support that they need, because it's the most dangerous time. It's the time when most homicides happen, when a survivor is planning or leaves a relationship. What they actually need is someone that is empathetic and gives a really good understanding response. What they say is professionals absolutely need to have a real deep understanding into domestic abuse, and a lot of what I've described to you, but much more in depth than in a 20-minute session. So we train police officers, we train health practitioners, we train lots of different, judges, barristers. We train them because they need to have an understanding of domestic abuse. When we carry out inspections for police forces, which we do, we do thematic interviews with survivors of domestic abuse, and one of the things that they always say is they don't understand what's happening to me. They come, and because there's a physical assault, they don't really understand what I'm living through day on and day out, because those physical assaults can happen once a month. For some, they happen more often, or once every 6 months. They only need to keep you in line when you step out, and often that's where the physical assaults happen. They absolutely said that they needed a safe space to talk. So what we always say to practitioners is, if someone comes to you and they're disclosing domestic abuse, you need to take them somewhere where they feel safe, to talk, and where they can't be seen as well. And what they also said is they need support for their children, and the effect that it has on their mental health. Remember, the world I've just described to you is the day-to-day world of a survivor, a victim of domestic abuse. Where there's children in the house, they're experiencing the same things. So when their mother is isolated from their friends and extended family, so those children, so they lose as much, and sometimes more actually, and that can impact on their mental health as well. And then they also said that they need practical support. So in order to be able to aid recovery, they need to feel safe in where they're living. They need financial and legal protection. So they need those things as well. And obviously our specialist services offer that. But ideally, we need to engage in a world where not just with health professionals, but with all professionals that they're coming into contact with and disclosing, can actually signpoint them to those specialist services, as well as supporting them as well within the remit of their own jobs. And most importantly, reduction on waiting times for services. So that's their big ask from our campaign, and I hope that it's given you a little bit more of an in-depth understanding as to what domestic abuse is, but also how possibly changes can be made so that survivors, wherever and whoever they report to, get a similar response and a supportive response. So you can show the last slide now, because that's just me saying thank you very much. And please absolutely go onto our website. We've got some amazing templates of things that you can use to support survivors of domestic abuse with as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqui. That was a really insightful session. We've just got one quick question, which is, spotting the signs of domestic abuse is difficult. So is there anything that as an employer we should be aware of?
Yes, there is. And you're right, it is difficult spotting signs in the workplace. I mean, some of often some of the signs are, which again actually is one of them, is what Laura had mentioned, is that there'll be avoidance of either going home, so they'll work late, or they'll come in early. But the other thing is timekeeping for them can be vital, because often the control is so severe that if they're not home, you finish work at 5, and if you're not home by 5:30, because it only takes you half an hour, you're going to be interrogated as to why you're late. So sometimes you'll get avoidance of social activities. So someone that has been going out with colleagues and friends suddenly stops doing it. Also work performance. I've worked with women that have been taken through capability procedures at work. Obviously, if women have injuries, they might avoid coming to work, so their sickness levels will go up. So, if you've got one or two of those, that is where you can ask. And what survivors of domestic abuse say is, actually, they don't mind being asked if everything's okay at home. We're really concerned, this has happened, that's happened. Is everything okay at home? And what they generally say is, they'd rather be asked than not asked. And if they're in a place where they don't want to divulge at that moment in time, they can say, no, it's fine. But if you don't ask, asking opens a door. So if you ask the question, it may be that it's the right time for them to say, actually, no, this is happening. You could even say, is everything okay at home? Are you aware of some of the policies that we have in place? So I hope that's answered your question.